So I did this talk as part of Alitio earlier this year. And there was actually a day set aside for gaming, which is awesome. Many people game, and as is mentioned in some of the literature around International Day of Persons with Disabilities, it's about taking part and contributing to society at large, right? And so that's where the gaming industry is looking forward-thinking and being more inclusive. And so, so this talk is about my experience and some of how, as I've grown older, I'm starting to age into disability a little bit, and how that correlates with what I call some people's default settings. And I can use my arrow keys. There we go. So I'm going to talk a little bit about myself and some of my experience. I'm going to talk about the industry in general and how it's grown up. I'm going to talk about some of the changes that I've experienced and some of the changes that have taken place in the industry. And there's a few actionable takeaways both for game developers and for gamers. So this is called old school. So I've been gaming for a long time, and I actually started going to arcades before they had screens. And so I'm showing here a screenshot of a game called Helicopter by Sega, circa 1976. This is a electromechanical amusement device, air quotes, and uses a series of levers to steer a helicopter around and land on specific target points within this glass box. And so that's what arcades were like in 1976. So, again, when I talk about old school, in my history, I'm mostly a console gamer. So does that mean 32-bit, like the PlayStation? Happy 25th anniversary, PlayStation, today. Does it mean 16-bit, like Genesis? No. Does it mean 8-bit, like NES? No. When I talk about old school and my console history, I'm talking about this bad boy. This is the Radio Shack TV scoreboard that my sister and I had. It was the fact that only one person could serve the ball meant a whole new way for siblings to fight. And so, you know, this is where my gaming history really kind of starts. Right? And so things have changed, obviously. And so in that change, rather than thinking about myself growing up with games, I think of myself as having watched games grow up. And so there's several ways that both humans and games have evolved over the years. And so one of those things is size, right? So people obviously get bigger as they grow older, up to a certain point. And in the gaming space, so back in the day when arcades were a thing in North America, if you could play for 15 minutes on one quarter, you were doing really well, right? That was a long time. Then some point in the mid-'80s, the original Legend of Zelda game was so large it actually had a battery inside the cartridge because you actually had to save your progress because you couldn't play it in one sitting. And now we have games that take hundreds of hours. This is an image here of, at the end of last year, Sony kindly reminded me that I spent 96 hours playing The Elder Scrolls Online. And that was only for 1 year, and it's been out for 5 years, so I don't even want to think about it. So one of the other ways that both people and games grow up is in capabilities. And so what I'm showing here is not a duck, it's not a platypus, it's a very rudimentary dragon from the 1979 Atari game called Adventure. And so it's pretty blocky and rudimentary. And so if we fast forward 40 years to today's dragons, they're quite a bit different. So this is a dragon from Elder Scrolls Online, and it's fully articulated, it speaks, it breathes fire, it'll kill you in a whole bunch of different ways. It takes multiple people to kill it. It's quite a different thing, right? And so, so as people grow older, we expand our capabilities physically, psychologically, cognitively, and otherwise, right? And so one of the other things, one of the other ways that people in games have both grown up is in complexity. People are complex, and we get more complex, and we think of more complex things. And so games have done this too. And so I'm showing an image of an Atari 2600 joystick. It's pretty simple, 4 directions and 1 button. And so today, what we put in front of people is I'm showing a DualShock 4. It's got more than 20 buttons, it's got a touchpad, it's got analog sticks, it's got a headphone jack, it's got a speaker, it's got rumble, it's got lights and motion controls. So this is a pretty complicated piece of hardware, and we're expected to be able to do pretty complicated things with it. And so moving on to some of the changes that I've experienced. So for me, I wear glasses. I probably actually need to get new ones. And so my vision has changed over time. Some people's vision doesn't change over time, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they have 20/20 vision, right? In a lot of modern games, there's more and more and more text as we have these more complicated interactions, these more in-depth storytelling. We have more text to read. And so some of what's happened in recent years is there's a game called The Witcher, where I have an animation here running where the player character, Geralt of Rivia, he's actually being set with a pair of glasses. And so this is to show that with this particular game, they actually have to do an update patch to increase the text size because so many people were complaining about it. Similarly, fast forward about 3 years, 4 years, and we still have the same issue. There's a game called Fire Emblem on Switch that came out maybe 6 months ago, and I don't know much about Fire Emblem. It's a series that's quite long running, but I'm not really a fan, I don't really follow it. But what I can tell you is that apparently the text is, quote, too damn small. There's petitions to fix it. It's ridiculously small, and that the game needs bigger text. So that's pretty much the only thing I know about Fire Emblem, which is pretty bad. Right? So we're not necessarily learning from our mistakes, right, as an industry. So hearing. So I haven't actually experienced a lot of hearing degradation per se, but personally, a lot of high-pitched sounds I find, I don't know what the right word is, annoying, I guess. And this is analogous to, if we look at some older classic games, a lot of the sound effects in the games were one-to-one with the action that was happening. And so you could tell what was going on, largely through the sound effects as well as the visuals. These days, in our complicated open world gaming options we have available to us, we have these large environmental soundscapes that we're listening to. And so something that is actually really good to see is in a game like Elder Scrolls, there's actually 7 or 8 audio sliders. And so you can choose to increase or decrease the volume of the ambient sound, the sound effects, the interface, the dialogue, the footsteps, and player voices. And so you can kind of pick the soundscape that works for you, which is really great. So something I have definitely experienced is a lessening of my dexterity. And so this is an image of, again, back to the Atari 2600. These are what are called the paddle controllers. And so quick show of hands if anyone has attempted to use these. And so I say attempted because they didn't work very well. And they actually were really cheap. And what they did was they gave you a kind of a jittery experience. And so, meaning no offense, my friends and I actually referred to them as the Parkinson's paddles, because that's what they effectively actually did, is they actually disabled you from playing the game, which is pretty sad, right? And so that's why I have a comment here, is this the world's first mass market disability simulator? Because that's really kind of what that did for us, right? It kind of opened our eyes a little bit. Reaction time. There's a lot of games that require you to do time-limited events. These are often called quick time events, where a certain button symbol will appear on a screen, and you have to press it within a split second, or else something bad happens. And so a game that's famous for having these type of events is the Uncharted series. And so there was a player named Josh Stroud, and he couldn't finish Uncharted 2. He actually had to get a friend of his to finish the game for him, because it required a bunch of these kind of button mashing interactions at the end of the game that weren't even really serving the story, to add insult to injury. So he contacted the developers, and eventually, through the next couple of iterations of this series, they figured out a lot of how to get around this. And so explicitly in Uncharted 4, it's one of the first AAA games that had an accessibility options menu in it. And one of those options is that rather than mashing the buttons, you can simply hold it down. And so that way, he could actually finish the game. It was great. I also actually turned that feature on too, because it's just tiring to mash the buttons. And so similar to that, there's also fatigue. And so this is more a case of a repeated activity over time. And so I enjoy a lot of rhythm games. I have an image here of Rock Band and another one of Hatsune Miku. There's a lot of rhythm games that feature this vocal lead singer. And so one of those games I actually couldn't finish all the way, because you have to play to the highest level. And I actually can't do that without seriously cramping my hands. And so there's these kind of barriers that people are experiencing, where you feel like you can get 95% of the way there, but then you can't finish the game, and that's a drag, right? So another thing is cognitive load. So at the end of the day, I go home and I play rhythm games, and I don't play games like Myst. And so one of the reasons for that is, in my experience with Myst was turn on the game, go to the first location, which is some kind of planetary observatory, then pause the game and go do a university course on astronomy, and then come back and then finish the puzzle. And I was just not up for that, and so that's my experience with Myst, was that, like, the second screen. And so so in a similar way, there's a lot of games that have puzzles that require you to remember things you did 3 hours ago in the game, or they just feel like kind of time-wasting distractions, right? And so I think this is something where, again, there's a place for the industry to look at difficulty levels and things like that, and maybe make some changes there. So what can we do about this? So game developers, right, they can provide options for people, right, and make those options easily discoverable. during the talks at LATO Gaming, the Spider-Man game that came out last year was actually referenced many times because they really did this well. This menu actually comes up as soon as you boot up the game. And it just basically says, before you start, the accessibility menu provides additional options for those wanting to adjust their visual, auditory, or motor settings. And it's just like, hey, you're gonna start, do any of these options interest you in making your experience better, right? That's pretty easy, right? We've also seen in some games where some of the larger text settings, for example, or text-to-speech features only work for the menus and not actually for the game. So that's kind of only a half job there. So something else is to look back, right? So some of the examples I've shown of some of the older interactions and some of those older controllers, some of those are great, some of those were not so great. But newer isn't always better, right? And then simplicity is a good thing at times. And if we think of, for example, that old school Atari joystick, it has an approachability that the 20-button controller we have today doesn't, right? And as players, we can speak out, right? We can call out issues. We can describe the impact that things are having on us. These are all design decisions that developers and game programmers are making, and they have impact. And so we can call those out, right? But let's, I think, do it positively so that we can move forward in a way that isn't adversarial, right? And we can all get there together. I have an example here. There's some tweets. These are a couple years old now. There's a game that came out that had very complex and non-standard controls. And so I tweeted to the developers, hey, can you please add button remapping? And then just for curiosity's sake, I took a look at what was going on with their game's hashtag. And this was on launch day. And half of Twitter was about, hey, I can't play this. Hey, can you remap the controls? Hey, what's going on? And it was really kind of sad because they obviously hadn't tested this very well, right? So there's a lot of different. Thank you.